We proudly welcome artist Samantha Sherry as our sponsor on the How to Love Lit podcast. Sam is a world-class artist specializing in animal portraits. We invite you to check out her work at samanthasherry.com. Tell her Christy and Gary sent you. Again, samanthasherry.com.
Shriver.
And I'm Gary Shriver, and this is the How to Love Lit podcast. Christy is an advanced placement and international baccalaureate literature teacher.
And Gary is an AP IB psychology, history teacher, and my husband. Last week we delved into section 1 of Fahrenheit 451, titled The Hearth and the Salamander. Today we're going to take in section 2, titled The Sieve and the Sand. And as we get ready to roll out the second section, I do have to give a shout out. Well, actually a couple of shout outs. The first being to my wonderful husband, because this week we spent the entire week, because it's spring break, in Cancun, Mexico, one of this hemisphere's amazing destinations. The Mexican people are some of the most gracious and hospitable. The beaches are some of the bluest, and the culture is thousands of years old. Gary and I laid on that beach and read this book in preparation for this podcast. And the irony was not lost on Gary that we were literally in a utopia on Earth reading about dystopia. So, with that bit of paradise on the mind, remind us, Gary, what we talked about last week.
Well, first of all, I'm a great lover of irony, so I guess that's my habit to notice things like that. And secondly, I have to give you the fun Christy fact that we haven't given you yet. You weren't expecting that, were you?
No.
Not only is Christy left-handed, she is the absolute most left-handed female you may ever meet in your life. Just thought I'd pass that along. Before I do, let me not forget to thank everyone that is listening to these podcasts with us. We hope you're enjoying the discussions and the engagement of the text as much as we are. And if you do like it, don't forget, subscribe. Also, check out our website for notes. If you're a teacher, look for instructional materials and some links about the things we talk about here. Last week, we got a good chance to talk with Montag and watch him engage and compare two very different women in his world, Clarice and Mildred. Now, let me sum up a little bit about what they did. Chapter 1 was mostly about the comparison between Clarice, who was engaged in her world, who was connected to people around her, who was in touch with her senses and the things that she was experiencing in life. Montag meets her on the way home from work one night after he's self-satisfied from burning some houses, and he has a conversation with Clarice that completely mystifies him. Then he goes home to his very detached wife, and what happens, Bradbury spends a lot of the first chapter contrasting the person of Clarice with the person of Mildred, setting you up for this dichotomy, this extreme of one person who's disconnected with the world and another person who's very connected with their world. And this becomes very intriguing to Montag. So there's a lot of that goes on in the first chapter. Then eventually we see Montag and his firemen friends, Beatty, Stoneman, and Black. They go to burn an old woman's home because she has books there. While they're in the process of burning a house down, the woman basically commits suicide by setting the house on fire herself because she would rather die with her books than without them. Montag is stunned by anybody who would have such a passion. He makes him wonder what's in books that would make anybody want to burn themselves alive like that. He steals a book. He goes home. Once again, he talks with Mildred. He's reminded of how pointless their relationship is. And then we finish the chapter with his chief, Beatty, coming to talk with him about the meaning of life. And they end that chapter with a great discussion.
All right, in today's section, just like the last section, the plot advancement really is very simple. The meat of the section is really going to center around the dialogue between Montag and a new character that we're going to meet, but mostly around the inner conflict that you see developing and really coming into a climax inside of Montag. So by way of spoiler, I do want to kind of run through the plot really quickly So then we can really engage in some of the extremely complex and nuanced philosophical and psychological arguments that we see Bradbury kind of putting forth through a very simple narrative. So point one, or plot point one, Montag and Mildred read together. Montag had thrown out these books after their visit, or really before their visit with Beatty in the first section, and he asks her to sit down and read them with him. Number two, Montag remembers and then tracks down Faber. 3, Montag is going to show Mildred a Bible. 4, Montag goes to see Faber and they have a discussion. 5, Montag comes up with this goofy plan that he wants to burn down all the firehouses. 6, Montag goes back home and engages Mildred and her friends in the parlor, eventually scaring them and making everybody cry. 7, Montag goes back to the firehouse, but this time he has this thimble doobie wobber in his ear so Faber can hear and talk to him while he engages Beatty. And 8, the firehouse gets a call. Beatty chooses to drive the salamander. They go to Montag's house. Chapter ends. All right, that's the action in a nutshell. So now that we kind of know where the story is going, let's go back and see this argument that Bradbury is really trying to make. Let me first say what I think the argument is, and then how I see this argument kind of unfolding. First of all, what I really think Bradbury is trying to do is show us that there is a connection between the value of human relationships and the value of self-discovery, which we kind of see unfold inside the life of Montag. And Bradbury is going to suggest that this engagement of history and literature and the arts that we find, and he personifies this through books, through the thoughts of mankind, somehow value and meaning are found and can only be found when we engage in these kinds of things and then engage in other people, creating some sort of human bond. And this is where we're going to find meaningful existence. So, Gary, do you agree with me that that's where this is going, or what are your thoughts? And then we'll talk about how we got there.
Well, a couple of things I want to say. First of all, you pointed out the plot's simple, but yet the narrative is really deep and really complex. And I also am intrigued by this idea that Bradbury is a science fiction writer, but yet the whole important meat of this book is about relationships and how scientific things attack it. I don't know if he intended that. I don't know. Like I've given my disclaimer before. I'm not a Bradbury expert, and they are out there, and they can. They certainly would know a lot more than I do. But I find it interesting that he keeps coming back to the importance of this human element and relationship element, and we see it played out, especially in chapter 2.
Yeah, he's certainly not a fan of robots and that kind of thing. Well, let's talk about chapter 2. It starts off, they're sitting there in the rain. I point this out because rain is as an archetype that he's kind of used before in chapter 1. On page 17, when he engages Clarice, it's in the rain. He describes her exactly as being in the rain. And rain, of course, is another symbol of spiritual birth. And we see this happening, and I think he's trying to say that he's going out there, Montag is going out there and kind of experiencing some sort of personal spiritual birth. And of course, Clarice just stands outside all the time in the rain as if she is one and of it.
It's one of the reasons why I think she's crazy.
Yeah, I probably would too, actually. So they're outside and it's raining outside, and he is going to engage it, and Mildred, we're going to see, is going to choose not to. But they're trying, and I have to give Mildred a little bit of credit. She wants to watch TV, but he's making her sit there and read, and she's sitting there doing it, kind of like how a lot of my kids in school stare at me when I make them read. But he starts off with this quote by this guy named James Boswell. Now, I wasn't really familiar with this writer. His most famous book is one where he writes as a biography of this guy named Samuel Johnson, who's a much more famous person. And in the book, in the part of the book that he quotes, which this quote is incredible in and of its own right, Montag reads this. And he reads it 10 times because he doesn't really understand it. And he says, we cannot tell the precise moment when friendship is formed. As in filling a vessel drop by drop, there is at last a drop which makes it run over. So in a series of kindnesses, there is at last one which makes the heart run over. Now that quote in and of itself I think is worth repeating, and I want to read it again because I want us to think about what he's saying. We cannot tell the precise moment when friendship is formed, which is interesting because Montag and Mildred are married, and if you would ask them, they would say they love each other, but they don't really seem as if they have what we would call a friendship.
Yeah, in the last chapter, Mildred couldn't even remember how they met.
And he says because friendship is in filling, and here's the analogy, it's in filling a vessel drop by drop. There is at last a drop which makes it run over. So how do you create friendship? Well, the only way, according to Boswell, that you're going to create friendship is if you have this communication, drop by drop. You talk. And this back and forth adds drops. And it's a series of kindnesses. There is at last one that makes the heart run over. And boom, you have a friend. And we see this expressed through James Boswell and Samuel Johnson. He was his biographer. They spent hours and hours and hours interviewing Johnson late in life. I think he was like 53 years old when this happened. And through this intense amount of time that they spent together, even though they didn't intend it, a friendship and meaning was found. And so Bradbury starts the chapter by making this argument that friendship is made when you engage people one-on-one in a conversational manner. He goes on to quote a second Boswell quote, which is hysterical, that I think Clarice kind of misunderstands. He says that Boswell also says that favorite subject, myself. He squinted at the wall. That favorite subject, myself.
To which Mildred said, "Oh, I understand that one."
Yeah, and she's meaning it in this really selfish, narcissistic way. Like, I love me. I love talking about me. I want to be in the movie. I want to look in the mirror. I want to doll myself up. I want to make myself up. And that's not, I don't believe, the way that Boswell intended it at all. He's trying to say that you have to discover yourself to find meaning and to be able to give back to other people. There has to be a sense of self-discovery, and that is a favorite topic, and it's not in a narcissistic way. In fact, it's in an important way. It's a way that enables you to engage yourself, understand yourself, engage each other, and be a contributing member, which is what he sees reflected in Clarice. Because in fact, Montag says, well, Clarice is the opposite of you. She's interested.
Her favorite subject was everyone else.
Right. And maybe it was, and maybe it wasn't. She was integral. She was whole. And so it expressed itself as a curiosity in other people. And of course, Mildred is interested in other people too, but they're the family, as she calls it.
Which is, for the listeners, every time we use the word family, that means her televisions.
Right. And of course, we see something else that's interesting, and I think is worthy of pointing out. Mildred is afraid, and she's really afraid that she's going to get caught. Actually, I think she has two feelings. She's bored out of her mind, and she's afraid she's going to get busted. And I have to wonder what she's so afraid of. Does she think they're going to burn her house down, or is she afraid of some sort of social repercussions that these books are going to infect her, and she's going to think a thought that she shouldn't think? I don't know. It doesn't explain it, but she's clearly horrified, and it almost feels a little bit irrational. And she says, why should I read? What for?
Well, of course, we saw in the last chapter that she was 200% for conformity. So, yeah, having books in her home is breaking conformity. So, we can leave that to interpretation, whether she did that out of fear of the firemen coming for her, or whether she feared losing conformity more.
So what she's not afraid of, and that's the bombers that are crossing the sky, going over the houses. They don't even notice. He brings it back again. And apparently it's getting bigger and bigger. They're circling. There's more violence. And it's just a part of everyday life.
Well, I want to go back to the poem for just a moment. So Montag reads this poem to Mildred, and how many times did you say he read it?
No, he just read the one quote. And it says he read it, 10 times?
Right.
Yeah.
And that's important. He reads it 10 times. And the name of this chapter is The Sand and the Sieve. And he tells a story about being a young child, or when Montag was a young child, that older kids played a dirty trick on him. They gave him a sieve and told him if he could fill it up with sand that he would get a reward for that. And it took him a while to catch on. You could never fill up the sieve because it's full of holes and the sand runs through it. Well, obviously, he's reading this poem 10 times, and he's in the poem is the sand, and it's going through his brain, which is the sieve, and he's having a hard time grasping its meaning. Now, in psychology, there's a field called linguistics, and all linguistics does is it studies the use of language, the meaning of language, how people interact with language, how we reify with language. And reify means you take something that's not real and you give it a linguistic meaning, and all of a sudden now it's real and it's there. Like I can throw out the word freedom. People can't really explain what freedom is, but they have an understanding that it's a good thing and it's a positive thing, but you ask them to explain it and they've reified it in different ways. Anyway, the point I want to make is that reading takes a couple of very specific psychological skills. When you're reading a book, and it's interesting that the sieve shows this, number one, you have to maintain a past narrative while you're reading a book. Number two, you have to make current sense of the page you are reading as you're collecting information. And number three, you are forecasting in your mind where the story is going, and you're making a judgment. Is the story interesting? Do I want to continue? Is it compelling? Is there any information I like? So you have three very complicated linguistic functions that it takes when you read things. And in Montag's world, all they do is read manuals, which really don't require all those skills. And so here he is now trying to take these three skills to implement and read something. He's staring at this poem over
Well, this
and over.
is not a very uncommon problem. In fact, I had a parent that came in last week and a child that came in, and we were reading Huck Finn, and she was saying, I'm reading this. I promise you I'm reading this. And she fails every test. She says, I read it. It just comes in and it goes out. It comes in and it goes out. And this idea that you have to be able, well, you're saying hold the meaning in your mind, which is true. But you also have to be able to visualize what's going on, like create a little movie of what it is and add the details that they have left out to be able to make sense of it. And the more complex the text is, of course, the more difficult that becomes. And what Montag is trying to read, well, in this case, he pulls out the Bible, which is an interesting piece for Bradbury to choose. Why I picked the Bible? Of course, it's one of the most important canonical books in Western culture. And whether you are a person who believes it's a sacred text written from the hand of God, or if you're a person who believes it's a human book, you have to agree that it's foundational to much of Western thought. And so it is indeed extremely complex, and it takes a lot to bring in.
Can you take a moment just to explain what you mean by canon or canonical? Right.
There are books that are a part of our culture, and they've been used to create our cultural understanding. So an author has said something very important, and then this has developed a conversation that has gone on over the ages. So, for example, the words of Jesus are not just words of Jesus that were spoken 2,000 years ago, but he's putting forth an argument. The argument that we see in this chapter, that we see that he's reading actually out of the Gospels. And the quote that he says, the lilies of the field, the lilies of the field, the lilies of the field. Well, that comes from a passage in the New Testament where Jesus is saying, you are foundationally important. As a human being, you have value. The lilies of the field have value, but you have more value. Well, this is a foundational concept that we have constructed our democracy on. Our institutions are based on this. The value of each individual worth is a discussion that we've had over the course of Western culture, and people have spoken to this. They've agreed with it. They've disagreed with it. To what extent am I valuable? To what extent are my needs important and versus someone else's needs? And other philosophers and other historians and other poets have weighed in on this. Shakespeare has weighed in on this. Plato has weighed in on this. And so those works are founded upon this, and they're also part of the canon. So Shakespeare is part of the canon. And, of course, the allegory of the cave is part of the canon. And over the course of time, books are added, and their value to me, and I feel like it's commonly understood, as do they or do they not contribute to this vertical conversation that we're having. And if they don't contribute at all, then they are not part of it. We don't read them. We read them for one generation. They're fun. Okay. They could be great, but they go away. They don't stick like some of these do. So he starts off, of course, with the Bible, and it's boring to Mildred, and he doesn't understand it either. But he comes back to the idea of there's some sort of meaning to this, and this meaning, whatever is in this book, has such important meaning that it's going to give me meaning. And he looks to her, and to me it feels like that the ideas don't connect. You really have to think about them to find the connection, because he looks at her and he says, does the white clown love you? He's looking at the television, which of course is not canonical. It's meaningless. It's not designed to have meaning. And he says, does the white clown love you? And she doesn't even understand the question.
Yeah, and what's interesting, when he looks at Millie and says, Millie, does the white clown love you? It's a question about intimacy. And it's about many things, but it's a question of intimacy. And once again, poor Montag takes another stab in the heart that Millie has no idea what love is about and connection and relationship.
No, and their whole world is designed to where you don't have to. Because remember, this is a society that is built on the idea that happiness is the goal. Life constitutes happiness, which is arguable. And there are many philosophers in Western culture, and I think Eastern as well, that would say happiness is not the goal. You do not find meaning. You don't find fulfillment in pursuing happiness. In fact, you find the exact opposite, which is the argument that he's putting forward.
Oh my gosh, he's hammering that like every page.
Right. And Mildred, he's going to say, isn't happy. She's got to take her pills. When she lets her guard down, when she stops the noise, when the white clown is quiet, she collapses. And so she keeps it on all the time. She never has that moment when when he goes to see Faber, which is what he's going to do next. The subway is blasting people with noise. Never think, never think, never think. Because in the thinking will you find discontentment. And of course, he found that to be true. So he goes and finds Faber. And when he gets in there...
Let me interrupt for just a second.
Yeah.
Remind us who Faber is.
Oh, yeah. So Faber is this guy that he had met years ago sitting on the bench. And he knew he was a weird guy, and he thought that he had seen him hiding a book or something in his shirt, and the guy had said, you can turn me in, something along those lines, and he didn't, and he kept he kept his contact information all these years. Let me put out there another funny little, it's not really important to understand the book, but I think it's kind of funny. Every year when I used to teach this book, I don't anymore, we would watch the A&E biography about Bradbury, which A&E makes amazing biographies, and they interviewed him, and what he tells the story that he wrote this book, of course, in 9 days in the basement of the library. And when he decided to name the characters, he looked up, and there were boxes of typing paper stacked up on the floor, and the company that made the typing paper was called Montag. That's where that name came from. Then he looked down, and he had next to him a pencil, just a number 2 pencil, and the company that made the pencil was Faber. And he has this, so Montag is the paper and Faber is the pencil. And so we're going to see.
Right, Montag's the blank paper being written upon by Faber.
That's it. And so this character is named Faber, and that's kind of who he goes to, his sage, his guru, to find out why are books so important that the woman would kill herself, and basically wants to know, can I find meaning in my existence? Because I feel like my life has no meaning, and I feel like there must be something to give me meaning if I can read it, and I try to read it, but I can't.
Well, and it's interesting to me, or it needed to be pointed out to me, that Montag thinks books are magical. What does Faber say about that?
Well, he completely challenges that idea. In fact, he goes on to say, no, They're not at all. In fact, it's not the books in and of itself. It's what are in the books. He says the books are a receptacle. And of course, today we have many receptacles. Movies are a receptacle. This podcast is a receptacle. So there are different ways that ideas are communicated and preserved. And it's through the preservation of ideas that you can engage yourself and engage other people. And he says there's some things that you have to have for this to happen. First of all, you have to have quality books that have features. He says that are going to have pores, that have something to say. And he's going to say something that is, of course, unpopular these days, that is controversial. They should make you feel uncomfortable. And today, even in school, we're often taught we don't want to have controversy because controversy will create disagreement. Disagreement will create antagonism, which will create hatred, which will create problems and discomfort. And of course, that's not what we want. And he's going to say, you have to have that. You have to be able to disagree about things. You have to be able to be wrong. And he says, in fact, he goes back and he references Jesus. He goes, Jesus today, Christ is one of the family now. He says, I often wonder if God recognizes his own son the way we've dressed him up or dressed him down. He's a regular peppermint stick now, all sugar, crystal, and saccharin. And of course, Jesus was anything but a peppermint stick or something that was easy to swallow. He was the first to say that my words are divisive. They divide families. In fact, they were so divisive, they divided a group of people to the point that they murdered him solely on the basis of what he was saying. So Christ, it was first and foremost a controversial character that was introducing the world with words that where he would have quality and features that were engaging people, and how you engaged his words created a very strong reaction. And Faber is going to say that's important. So you have to be able to engage difficult things, think through them that people could potentially disagree with. And the second thing you have to have is leisure. You want to speak to that?
Well, I want to go back for just a moment to the whole books are not magical conversation. Faber, I feel like, is introduced at this point because up to this point, Montag is pursuing books and what they might hold in the same way that Millie was pursuing her sleeping pills. He thought maybe they had some pleasing anesthetic power. I don't know. But Faber is interjected into discussion to say, no, they're not another form of a sleeping pill. They're not ear thimbles with music playing. They're a whole completely different entity. And what books do is that they record life with all of its pores, as he said. In other words, warts and all. And for the point of making life three-dimensional, Mildred's world was all these flat screen televisions, which her world was two-dimensional. And Faber's saying, no, the life is three-dimensional. And he says these books have details because they have to have details because we're afraid that we'll forget what life is about without those details.
Well, it's also interesting that one of the complaints that Mildred says is that the books aren't real. And people say that about fiction all the time. Why do you read fiction? It's not real. Well, a person who studies literature would argue, and I think it's absolutely true, that they are real. In fact, perhaps they're more real. They're presenting life in an abstract way. They're not a reflection of one person's life, but they're kind of a discussion about things that happened in life in kind of a condensed form, and it allows the writer to present, this is the way I engage the world. This is looking at the world through my lens. This is how you see it. So you can never live another person's life except vicariously. And so it gives you the opportunity to engage another reality in an honest way and an open-minded way, which other mediums can't do.
And most importantly, Bradbury has this great quote that's going to come through Faber. Maybe books, the most important reason we have books, he says, books remind us what asses and fools we are.
Oh, that is
love
an
that.
awesome quote.
It is. And when I read that, I immediately thought, oh, that is the arrogance of the present. In other words, if you think the life you are living in this current moment is the most advanced life is ever going to be, that we are the most enlightened and all these kind of things, you have this arrogance of the present. And if you don't ever read a book or do anything that takes you away from this current present moment, you become well, let me say this. You see this current moment as the authoritative statement on everything. And as a result, you end up with this arrogance. And so books take you away from that and remind you, if you take yourself too seriously, you're an ass and a fool.
Well, yeah, because everyone's lived the same thing in a different setting over and over again. The hurts that I have are the same ones that Hester Prynne had and the same ones that Antigone had. And you're talking about crossing time and space.
And that's an excellent point, because you can get caught up when you have pain. You can get caught up in the trap of thinking your pain is the most unique pain ever felt. And that is isolating when you can realize whatever pain it is you felt have been shared by millions of people.
Well, and the way they deal with pain in this society is just to ignore it and to drown it out with something else, which brings us to the second thing that he thinks you have to have, which is leisure. And what he means by leisure is not, the opportunity to fly to Cancun, although there is credit to that.
Or the opportunity to smash up cars or hit dogs and rabbits, or those other forms of entertainment in chapter 1 of the book.
Yeah, but what he's saying is to sit still, and I think today we might even call it mindfulness, and quietly think. Think about what someone says and come to your own conclusions. To what degree does this have merit? To what degree do I identify with any particular concept or belief or philosophy that I didn't already know? And so you have to have, he says, leisure to digest it. And then the third thing is unusual. And I wouldn't have thought that a literature professor would have said this, but of course, Bradbury has this literature professor saying it. He says you have to have, number 3, the right to carry out actions based on what we learn from the interaction of the first 2. Meaning you have to feel like you have personal agency to do something with what you're thinking, which we see Mildred doesn't have. She doesn't want personal agency. She doesn't want to be different in any kind of way. And you have to have that freedom, or you can't be a fully engaged human being. Let's talk about one more thing before we get rid of Faber's discussion. We move on to the next part of the book. He talks about the fact that we dropped reading voluntarily. He says, basically, he said, we pursued ignorance as fast as we could. We wanted to be stupid. We sat around with our fingers in our ears and said, I don't want to learn, I don't want to learn, I don't want to learn. He was going to say the newspapers didn't quit producing them because they made them. They stopped producing them because people were only interested in 2 kinds of news, and he calls it passionate lips and the fist of the stomach. In other words, we like to hear about gossip and we like to hear about violence. He also says one other thing. He says they shut down the universities because nobody wanted a liberal education anymore, which I find interesting because, when I gave my daughters advice about what they wanted to do with college, I said, well, whatever you do, make sure that you come out with a degree that will give you cash at the end. I wanted them to have a marketable degree. Well, liberal education is designed not to provide a marketable degree at all. It's designed, liberal means as in you're going to have liberty of thought.
And a large general body of knowledge instead of a specific body of knowledge.
Right, so that you can problem solve. You're not learning how to fix something. You're learning the complex concept of solving larger existential problems. And he says we stopped that because nobody cared anymore about that. People didn't want to engage text. They didn't see the value of the canon. They didn't want to talk about the meaning of things. And he says that there's a great loss in that. How do you feel about that? Of course, as a history teacher, that's what he's talking about. We don't care anymore about history.
Well, yes, and I'm going to avoid the arrogance of the presence myself in my comment right here. It's certainly the tradition of teachers and people who are cultural critics to currently say that the age we are living in, people are getting dumberer and dumberer and becoming less able intellectually. I don't know. We just grow in different directions in how we learn and what we consume and now we have the first digital generation hitting high schools that have had to incorporate a digital world that's new in their learning and their ability to think. So they're abandoning some old traditional ways of learning and problem solving while they're engaging this whole new digital world.
And I think Bradbury was terrified of that. I don't think he knew. He had no way to know of where that would go. But he saw the risk in that because it could produce lazy thinkers if you have somebody that's thinking for you.
Well, like we say about the internet will certainly give you a lot more information, but it will not make you more intelligent.
No. And he says, I think, you talked about your favorite quote in the book. I think my favorite quote in the whole book comes right out of this section too, when he says, because I really think this is true. He says, those who don't build must burn. In other words, you're going to be the group of people, part of that group of people that creates something, this positive energy that pushes forward, or you're going to be the part of the culture that tears down and slashes and burns what other people have built, attacks. You have this voice of anger, this voice of deconstruction, and he goes, you're going to either be one or the other, and the person who is likely to disengage is a burner, so to speak.
A burner. You're either a producer or a consumer.
Yeah, he sees it as very cut and dry, black and forth, two different groups of people. Do you think that's true?
Well, I mean, you can't take 7 billion people and put them in two groups. But I think those threads are there, and especially psychologically, when you get into therapy situations, one of the things you assess when working with somebody is, are they a consumer? Are they a taker? That's a very important aspect to understand. Or are they somebody being taken advantage of by a taker?
And he's going to say, and I think it's, of course, I find in myself those two sides. And when I'm participating in building, I don't have the energy to destroy, and I don't even want to. I can be more forgiving of other people in a different kind of way. So he references all this, and then, of course, goofball Montag says, "Oh, I'm just going to burn down all the fire stations," and he has a very a simple solution, and all thinking starts simply.
Yes, he's going to sneak books into the firehouse. Then he's going to tell the authorities the firehouses are full of books. Go burn down the firehouses.
And I find it interesting that Faber doesn't actually just rip them apart, because this is silly. But he challenges it, and he gives them this other option. Why don't you just go back and take my little headphone with you and engage, your old buddies. And this time I'll go with you and see what happens. So they do. They go back, but before he gets to the firehouse, he has to go by the women. And he can't help it. He has to mess with them. And I find it interesting because he's got all this passion. And he feels something so deeply, and it's just going to express itself in this very dangerous and not necessary way.
Well, it's interesting. Whenever people develop a new passion, there's always a maturity that lags behind it, the maturity that can not control the passion but can steer it. So you don't want to necessarily turn the laser beam off. You want to direct the laser beam, and of course he's not good at that yet.
No, and the idea is he's doing exactly what you're supposed to do when you get a new idea. According to Faber, he got this new idea. He had this thought. He had like 5 minutes to think about it. I guess not intense labor, but he's going to exercise his right to have an actionable, choice of what he wants to do with it. And so he's going to exercise his freedom and freak out these women.
And how does he freak them out?
Well, they're all sitting there in there with their, highly stimulating television, which is deliberately designed just to kind of be lights and flashes, which I find interesting because I like these kinds of shows too. When I think about I don't know, like the Bourne Identity movie series, I like those movies, but basically they're just chases. Like you just watch somebody run, and they're very jumping on this, jumping on that, going around, crashing, burning. All those things are stimulating it, but they're not really deep, so to speak. And of course, he describes it as monstrous crystal chandeliers tinkling in 1,000 chimes. Their Cheshire cats smiling, birding through the walls of the house. So it's bang, 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 stimulus, 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 stimulus. And you think you might have some meaning there, but really there isn't. And it's just fun.
He does a very rude thing. He reaches over and turns all the panels off. And now we're going to read. This is a group of people who, anyway, I find the whole scene amazing.
Well, it's horrible, and it's described as the images drained away as if the water had been let from a gigantic crystal bowl of hysterical fish, which is really funny imagery.
That is. That's great.
And the first question that he asks wasn't about, hey, you want to read this book? Let me read you this philosophical thing. He says this: I notice your husbands aren't here tonight. Mm-hmm. So he goes back, and like I said, this relationship between the interpersonal. And because he's seeing that disconnect is affecting his soul and his heart, and it's affecting theirs too. And you see that they don't have a connection either with their husbands. In fact, they draw attention to this. He says, well, Pete's at war. Going to be a quick war, 48 hours. And then she says, Pete and I, we've already decided we're not going to cry if something were to happen. We're independent. Be independent, he always said. If I get killed, you just go right ahead and don't cry. Get married again and don't think of me. And of course, they all kind of have this kind of detached relationship, not just with their husbands. And he's not attacking romance or anything like that. They have the same thing going on with their kids.
Well, yeah, the husbands are disposable and interchangeable. And the children are the same. And one of the ladies talks about her children and said they just as soon kick as kiss me. And I have them 3 days a month, but I'm always able to get rid of them and put them in school and do all those kind of things. And so he's laying bare all their detachedness from their relationships. And then to try to throw him off this disturbing conversation, they say, well, let's talk politics to please Guy, as if that's going to be an improvement.
And it sounds improving. Politics sounds serious. And you see that they have as much political engagement as a child. They're selecting their president based on his beauty. Oh, he's a beautiful man, which lots of people do. This guy's ugly. And you see that they're being manipulated through the television on what to think about any particular thing, and the manipulation isn't even very deep. It's very simplistic. They don't want to think about anything, so they just make snap judgments. Of course, you're going to select Winston Noble over Hubert Hogg, or Hogue, however you say that. It's horrible. And of course, Montag wants to, jump onto something a lot deeper. And so he says, well, let's just talk about poetry. And that's everyone's death words.
I would like to say this in defense of Montag and everybody else. Poetry is difficult for people who have been reading.
It is difficult. And poetry is designed to be difficult. It's this condensation of language. You're not supposed to read a poem just once. You're not supposed to get it. You're supposed to meditate on it. You're supposed to think through it. It's supposed to have so many layers, and it's a real hard, difficult mental exercise, which we're going to have a supplement to this episode because we know you want to get into some poetry.
Well, I wanted to say, first of all, Montag is going to read this poem, Dover Beach, which is a very fascinating selection that Bradbury has taken to help make his point in this part of the story. And we will do a separate podcast where we talk about that. And I want to tell you right now, Christy is an excellent poetry teacher. That alone is worth the listen. She will explain a lot of great things about the structure and form of poetry. And once you get some of those explanations and you look at this poem and it gets taken apart and gets reapplied back to Fahrenheit 451, you will admire Bradbury even more for his selection of this particular poem at this particular point in the story.
Well, that's true. Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold, it's probably one of his most famous poems, is an awesome poem, and we definitely need to talk about it at length. But he wants to read it, and you see that he's going to make them, against their will, listen to them read. And he begins to read in a low, stumbling voice that grows firmer as he progressed from line to line. And it says this: his voice went out across the desert into the whiteness and around the three sitting women there in the great hot emptiness. And of course, all these adjectives are used metaphorically because empty can't be hot, but it's just this intensity of, I guess, rage. They're super mad. And he reads it. The sea of faith was once too at the full and round earth's shore, lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled, but now I only hear its melancholy long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind down the vast edges, drear and naked shingles of the world. Now, if you're like every other student in literature, you just went, huh?
I just had a sieve moment right there.
I know.
I just went through.
You're supposed to.
But I do want to talk about the women's reaction. Mrs. Phelps cries. This is so disturbing to these women to have this poem read to them. And there are reasons why. Tell us some of the reasons why they're crying and upset about just hearing this poem.
Well, first of all, they're confused, and they don't want to be confused. They live in a world where you have sounds and everything's simple, and you're fed everything, and you don't feel any need, and you're being read stuff that you can't understand. That in and of itself, I think, leaves them disconcerting. But the second section of this poem that he pulls out says, "Ah, love, let us be true to one another, for the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy nor love nor light." Now that's the most famous line in the poem. Ah, love, let us be true to one another. Well, these are passionate words, and you can, even if you don't understand the context, you feel I think anyone would feel the passion of the poet. And yet he says something like, the world hath really neither joy nor love nor light nor solitude nor peace nor help for pain. And those are all negative things. And she's being confronted with these maybe for the very first time, and it just bothers her. And it ends with ignorant armies clash by night. And of course, her husband's at war. These are, you don't want to think about this stuff. It's not nice.
Well, needless to say, it does not go well. And Faber is whispering in Montag's ear through his earpiece that he's created, telling Montag, play it off, get out of the situation, go throw the book in the incinerator, act like you're having your... every fireman has their one time in their life where once a year, they get that crazy from being around books. Pretend like this was your once a year crazy moment, get out of the situation. And so Montag does. And I feel like we go on to a very, very important line later on as Montag gets done talking to these women. It says, out of two separate and opposite things a third, and one day he would look back upon the fool and know the fool, I guess referring to himself. He says, even now he could feel the start of the long journey, the leave taking, the going away from the self he had been.
Yeah, you see this. Well, he's done a very, very dangerous thing, and I really think you could almost say that this is a climactic moment from him. And the climax and stories, people think it means like the point where they have the biggest part of the action, which
the big reveal. Yeah,
which in this case doesn't happen until the next section in terms of the plot. But right here, he's doing something from which he cannot retreat. He exposes himself. He exposes Mildred to her friends, to their community, and he can't go back from this. And he's confronted by these women. Silly words, silly, awful, hurting words. They're equating it to hate speech. You're hateful. You're hurting us. You're aggressing us. And he pursues onward, and he says, go home. And he goes, think about your husbands blowing their brains out because one of the women's husbands had committed suicide. Think about yours getting killed in war. Think about the dozens of abortions that you've had. Go home, go home, go home. And he's basically saying, think about difficult things that are going to pain you, things that are going to make you uncomfortable. And he can't go back from that. Even Millie's not going to let him go back from that.
This is a very important thing. Whenever you deal with people who have a sea change, and a sea change to me is that moment where they realize the world is different than what I ever thought it was before, and I can no longer go back. Interestingly enough, in dealing with abuse victims in therapy, many abuse victims don't make that turn, but the ones that do, you can see this sea change that comes over their face, and they realize in the deepest recesses of their mind, life is very different from what I thought it was. And I feel like Montag is having this kind of abuse victim wake up, and he understands upon pain of death, I can't go back to anything I ever was. And he's stuck. He doesn't know how to go forward. He only knows he can't go backwards. And
he does go forward. And of course, he's going to go now. He had the success in beating down the women. Woohoo. Now he's going to go try to beat down Beatty, and he's not going to be successful.
Well, before we move on to that, I want to tell you this. I'm a shameless Shinedown fanboy. I love the band Shinedown, have for years. They've got a great song called Unity, one of my favorites. And it's got a couple of lines in there that I immediately thought of when I read this in Fahrenheit 451. The line says, they say it's never too late to stop being afraid, and there is no one else here, so why should I wait? And in the blink of an eye, the past begins to fade. And the next important lines are, so have you ever been caught in a sea of despair, and your moment of truth is the day that you say, I'm not scared? I see Beatty having that moment.
You mean Montag?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I see Montag having that moment.
Yeah, he's not scared. He doesn't care. And he's going to go forward, and he's going to confront Beatty, who really, to me, symbolizes, well, he is the power structure of the time, and he is knowledgeable. He's not like these women who've never read a book in their life. He's super well read, and the rest of the section with he and Montag talking is him throwing quote after quote after quote, and Montag can't match them.
It's a quote war, and even Faber, who's talking in his ear, can't match him either.
Right, and he even quotes the Bible. And he says the devil can cite scripture for his purpose, which is, of course, out of the Bible. So he can use it any way he wants to. And he's going to make the point, and it is a valid point. He says that the words that you're reading don't agree with each other. So you can't just stop listening to me and listening to them and find truth there. They don't even agree with themselves. They're controversy at every point, and you're going to engage that.
Which is interesting because Beatty has summed up the whole argument against books. There's controversy, conflict, and difference. And Faber's been saying that's the beauty of the books. There's controversy, and they conflict.
And Bradbury is making the argument that that's where we find meaning. We don't find meaning in agreement, which is really what you would think. We find peace in the world when everyone is in total agreement. And Bradbury is making the argument, no, you find peace in your relationships when you're allowed to kind of duke it out intellectually. You're not going to let it escalate to violence. You don't have to. There's respect there. I respect you, so I'm not going to aggress you, but I am going to challenge you. And through this endeavor of challenging, the drops of friendship are formed, life is created, meaning is constructed, value is found, and people give. This is a giving society instead of a taking society. And of course, Beatty is completely opposed to all this and just shuts it down.
Right. And he, like we said, it's a quote war. He goes to war with Montag, fielding contradictory quote after contradictory quote and saying, books are traitorous friends. You can't trust them. Their ideas compete and they conflict.
And at the end of the day, they load up and he says, well, we're out. And the truck pulls out, and this time Beatty is driving. And this, I think, is where we see this engagement of technology, where Bradbury is introducing the third idea that I think is important, and that technology can be used to create tyranny and to shut down conversation. And that's what the mechanical hound is doing. It's shutting down the conversation. And when the conversation is shut down, that's when you lose everything. And so they've jumped in the salamander, and they're getting ready to, basically, we're shutting this thing down. No more talk. And
they get in the salamander, and Beatty is driving, which he does not ordinarily do. They're driving fast. They're sliding around the corners. It's more urgent than Montag has seen before. And then they get to their destination, and they look up, and it's Montag's home. They've come to burn.
Oops. Okay. Well, we'll pick up on that next time. I hope you enjoyed our discussion today. As you can tell, Gary looks at these texts, many of them are my favorite books, from a different perspective than I do. Some of these books I've taught for years from a traditionally literary perspective. He brings fresh eyes from the context of history, psychology, and culture, being a musician and a teacher. I hope, if nothing else, we've given you something to think about today. And don't forget, if you have a particular book you like us to talk about, or if there's something in this discussion that we really should have added, let us know on our Facebook or Instagram page. We'd love to hear from you. It's not our goal, I hope, that you realize that you agree with us. We just want you to engage the books and enjoy thinking about them like we do.
So, coming to you from Memphis, Tennessee, again, thank you for sharing your time with us today. Reach out to us anytime on our Facebook, Instagram page, or website. Until next time, when we conclude Fahrenheit 451 with the final section called Burning Bright.
Don't forget to subscribe. Peace out.